How does a teenager who once had the entire world dancing in the palm of his hand end up standing over the lifeless body of his own cousin with a smoking gun? This is not just a story of a fallen star. It is a cold investigation into a psychological collapse that the world ignored until it was too late. In 2015, the name Silento was synonymous with joy. His anthem, "Watch Me Whip, Nae Nae," was a global virus that infected over 1,800,000,000 people on YouTube alone. From the halls of the White House to the smallest villages in China, everyone knew the face of Richard Lamar Hawk. He was a 17-year-old kid from Georgia with a $5 million net worth and a smile that seemed to promise a golden future. But while the world was busy mimicking his dance moves, a much darker reality was brewing beneath the surface. A reality rooted in a genetic curse and a mind that was slowly fracturing under the weight of untreated trauma. The investigation into the fall of Silento begins long before the music ever started, in a delivery room where a newborn baby was already fighting for his life. Richard Hawk entered this world in January 1998, not with a silver spoon, but with a cocktail of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana already circulating in his tiny system. He was born into a darkest hour, a child of the drug epidemic who was forced to inherit the addictions and mental instabilities of his parents. Raised in a household of 7 women, he sought a broken shield of protection in his grandmother, but the demons in his DNA were already marking their territory. By the time he became a global sensation, he was already battling diagnosed bipolar disorder and severe depression. The industry saw a natural giant of entertainment, but in reality, he was a ticking time bomb, a young man whose mental health was a silent scream that no amount of money could silence. The turning point from a utopian success to a literal nightmare was marked by a series of increasingly violent and delusional outbursts that the public mistook for typical celebrity eccentricities. The mask finally slipped when Silento began a descent into madness that saw him arrested for wielding a hatchet in a stranger's home, terrified children screaming as he searched for a phantom girlfriend. He was no longer the boy the world loved. He was a man lost in a psychotic break, claiming that the government was tracking his every move through satellites and that Donald Trump was sending him secret pleas for help. His big voice was now being used to scream at police officers while he drove his luxury SUV at over 140 miles per hour, convinced that his fame made him untouchable by the laws of men. This was the broken shield of a superstar who had lost all contact with the ground. The final, blood-soaked act occurred on a quiet Georgia street in February 21. The investigation reached its most tragic conclusion when 8 shell casings were found scattered around the body of Frederick Rooks, Silento's own cousin. The man who had taught the world to dance was now the primary suspect in a malice murder, identified by neighborhood security cameras as he fled the scene of the execution. This was the ultimate, darkest hour, a moment where the viral fame of a teenager met the cold reality of a jail cell. Today, Silento sits in isolation, a natural giant reduced to a cautionary tale about the intersection of inherited trauma and the predatory nature of overnight success. As we peel back the layers of this tragic file, we see a boy who was never given a chance to be healthy, a king of the internet, who was dead inside long before he ever pulled the trigger. This is the complete and terrifying investigation into the life, the crimes, and the silence of Richard Lamar Hawk. The foundation of the Richard Hawk investigation lies deep within the walls of a modest house in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where a young boy was raised in an environment that was simultaneously a sanctuary and a psychological minefield. Born to parents whose lives were systematically dismantled by the peak of the crack and opioid epidemics, Richard was the only male in a household dominated by 7 women. His mother, grandmother, and aunts provided the only broken shield he ever knew, but they could not protect him from the chemical warfare that was already occurring inside his own body. Medical records and later testimonies from his defense team reveal a chilling reality. Silento was a drug baby, born with multiple high-level narcotics, including cocaine and heroin, circulating in his newborn system. This was his first and most defining darkest hour, a profound chemical and neurological imbalance gifted to him by his parents before he even took his first breath in this world. This genetic burden created a natural giant who was physically capable but mentally fragile, inherently prone to the same cycles of addiction and erratic behavior that had destroyed the generation of men before him. His grandmother became the primary turning point in his early development, acting as the anchor in a sea of domestic chaos. She was the first to recognize a big voice in the small boy, encouraging him to sing and dance as a desperate way to escape the crushing weight of their financial and social reality. However, even her profound love could not mask the daily trauma of his immediate surroundings. Richard grew up witnessing family members losing their grip on reality, observing high-level domestic violence and relatives who frequently talked to walls or fought phantom enemies in the middle of the living room. These early experiences left him with a severe case of undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder long before he ever stepped into a professional recording studio. While other children were playing and dreaming of the future, Richard was busy absorbing the silent screams of a family in a constant state of crisis. He was eventually diagnosed with a complex combination of bipolar disorder and severe depression, along with a prescription for a cocktail of mood stabilizers and sleeping pills that he would struggle to take consistently for the rest of his life. The investigation into his adolescent years shows a boy desperately trying to find a utopian escape through the power of music. At the age of 13, the sudden death of his grandmother shattered his broken shield once and for all, removing the only person who truly understood the demons he was fighting. Without her steady guidance, Richard began a rapid descent into a darkest hour marked by frequent school fights and repeated stints in juvenile detention centers across the state of Georgia. He was eventually moved to his aunt's house, which offered a more financially stable environment, but the transition only served to intensify his growing feelings of being a permanent outsider in his own community. In this new school environment, he was the target of relentless and cruel bullying. He was a natural giant who was picked on for his unique clothing style and his quiet, introspective nature. This was the specific period where he adopted the stage name Silento, which he claimed stood for the phrase, "less talk, more action." It was a psychological defense mechanism, a way to signal to the world that he would no longer be a victim of his circumstances or his peers. He poured all of his pent-up frustration and pain into a local rap group called Young Swag Kids, attempting to create positive music about achieving good grades in school. He was desperate to prove that he could be a role model in a world that already viewed him as a tragic statistic of the foster care and prison systems. As the investigation moves into his final high school years, we see the blueprint for his massive global success being drawn in a dark basement. Living with his aunt, who worked as a professional pharmaceutical representative, Richard was constantly pressured to follow a traditional and stable professional path. However, his mind was fixed on the big voice he knew he possessed within him. He began banging on the bathroom sink for hours every day, creating the rhythmic foundation for what would eventually become the most famous dance song of the entire decade. He was a natural giant in the making, performing at local talent shows and neighborhood birthday parties, fueled by the musical influences of global icons like Michael Jackson. He wanted to be a utopian star who did not need to use curse words or promote gang violence. He wanted to be the light in a very dark neighborhood, but he was unaware that the demons from his birth were simply waiting for the right moment to reclaim his soul. The third act of the Richard Hawk investigation centers on the precise moment a basement experiment turned into a global infection that no hit could have predicted. By early 2015, the rhythmic patterns Richard had been tapping out on his aunt's bathroom sink had evolved from a simple distraction into a full-scale musical draft. He was a teenager with a big voice and a singular vision, but he lacked the technical tools and professional recording equipment to bring his creation to life. He reached out to a local producer named Bolo, a man he had worked with previously during his brief time with the group known as Young Swag Kids. For several months, Richard was a persistent shadow, constantly begging Bolo to record the song he called "Watch Me Whip Nae Nae." Bolo was initially dismissive, viewing the track as a simple and perhaps even childish collection of existing dance trends. However, as a Christmas gift in late 2014, Bolo finally agreed to produce a simple beat and record the vocal tracks for the persistent teenager. Once the track was uploaded to the digital platform SoundCloud, the investigation shows a viral trajectory that remains one of the fastest in the history of the modern internet. On the first day of its release, The song garnered exactly 1,000 plays. By the second day, it had reached 4,000. Within just a few days, those numbers had exploded into the millions, creating a utopian frenzy among record labels who suddenly realized that a 17-year-old kid from Georgia had cracked the code for a global virus. A massive bidding war erupted, with every major player in the music industry desperate to secure the natural giant of viral marketing. Richard eventually chose to sign with Capitol Records, entering into a lucrative 4-album contract because the label represented many of his personal idols like the Migos and Katy Perry. On May 5, 2015, the official music video was released to the public, and the world was introduced to the phenomenon of Silento. The sheer scale of this utopian experience was unprecedented for an independent artist of his age and background. The investigation highlights that Watch Me Whip Nae Nae was not just a song. It was a massive cultural shift that crossed every demographic and geographic border on the planet. Silento became a multi-millionaire almost overnight, with a net worth estimated at $5 million before he was even old enough to legally buy a drink in his own country. He was suddenly performing on the biggest stages in the world, from the Soul Train Music Awards to the MTV Video Music Awards. His big voice was being heard in every nightclub, every school gymnasium, and every household in America. However, this sudden and overwhelming influx of wealth and fame created a dangerous broken shield of false security. While the entire world was dancing to his rhythm, the underlying mental health issues from his darkest hour in Stone Mountain remained completely untreated and ignored by those around him. During this period of peak success, a significant turning point occurred within his personal support system. His aunt, who was a pharmaceutical professional, attempted to act as a broken shield for his finances, protecting his earnings and ensuring he remained in school until he turned 18 and graduated. This was a rare moment of stability in a career that was moving at a dangerous and unsustainable speed. But as the money grew, so did the jealousy within his extended family and his social circle. The investigation reveals that the utopian dream of sharing his success with his loved ones quickly turned into a darkest hour of betrayal and deep resentment. Richard began to feel that people only valued him for the Silento brand and the money he generated, not for the boy who had once been bullied in the hallways of his high school. This isolation, combined with the onset of adult responsibilities, began to fracture his already fragile mental state, leading him toward a descent that no amount of platinum records or YouTube views could stop. He was a natural giant standing on a pedestal made of glass, and the first cracks were already starting to appear. The pressure of maintaining a utopian image while fighting a darkest hour inside his mind was becoming an impossible burden for the young star to carry alone. The fourth act of the Richard Hawk investigation dives into the clinical reality of a superstar whose mental health was deteriorating in front of a global audience. As the viral momentum of his debut single began to plateau, the utopian shield of fame could no longer hide the cracks in his psychological foundation. By 2018, the internal demons that Silento had carried since his drug-exposed birth were beginning to manifest as erratic public behavior. His management team, increasingly concerned about the natural giant's future and safety, attempted a public intervention. They booked him for an appearance on the Emmy Award-winning daytime talk show known as The Doctors. This was a critical turning point where the private struggle of Richard Hawk was televised as a national investigation into the mental health crisis within the entertainment industry. He sat across from board-certified clinical psychologist Judy Ho, admitting for the first time that his big voice was often silenced by a darkest hour of depression that had haunted him since childhood. During the televised session, Silento provided a raw and unfiltered look into his fragmented mind. He explained that his sudden overnight celebrity status had not fixed his problems. It had only added a massive layer of pressure to an already unstable core. He described the constant presence of demons, a term he used to characterize the auditory hallucinations and the crushing weight of bipolar disorder that made it difficult to distinguish reality from delusion. The investigation revealed that while the world was watching him dance, he was fighting a silent war for his own sanity every single day. The show conducted a full psychological evaluation over a period of 4 days, confirming that Richard was suffering from severe clinical depression and anxiety. However, The most tragic aspect of this broken shield moment was his refusal to follow through. After the show aired, Silento failed to attend any of the follow-up therapy sessions or consistent medical appointments that had been meticulously scheduled for his recovery. The investigation shows that the onset of the global pandemic in 2020 served as the ultimate darkest hour for his mental state. With the world in lockdown, the constant movement of touring and the validation of live crowds were suddenly removed. For a man who relied on the utopian high of performance to distract him from his internal pain, the isolation was a death sentence. His income began to slow down significantly, and the financial pressure compounded his biological instability. It was during this period that his behavior shifted from erratic to dangerous. He reportedly attempted suicide as his bipolar disorder spiraled out of control without the structure of a professional medical plan. The big voice that had once united millions in a simple dance was now a broken shield, unable to protect him from the darkness of his own thoughts. His management team watched helplessly as the natural giant they had helped build began to engage in self-destructive acts that would soon lead to a series of violent criminal encounters. The psychological file on Richard Hawk during this time suggests a total loss of touch with reality. He began to believe that governmental satellites were tracking his every move and that high-profile political figures were communicating with him directly. This was a classic manifestation of his untreated bipolar disorder entering a manic phase with psychotic features. The transition from being a role model to a liability was nearly complete. He was no longer just a struggling artist. He was a man in the midst of a profound psychological break that the legal and medical systems had failed to catch. This fragmentation of the mind was the primary engine driving the chaos that would soon erupt on the streets of California and Georgia. While his publicist tried to maintain a utopian narrative of a young man just going through a rough patch, the reality was a darkest hour that was rapidly expanding into a total eclipse of his soul. He was a natural giant wandering in a desert of his own making, and the next steps would be fatal. The fifth act of the Richard Hawk investigation marks the terrifying transition from a private mental health crisis to a public safety threat that could no longer be ignored. By late August 2020, the utopian facade of the global superstar had completely shattered, replaced by a series of violent and erratic incidents that suggested a total loss of impulse control. The first darkest hour of this period occurred in Orange County, California, where Richard was arrested following a domestic disturbance. He was charged with inflicting corporal punishment on a spouse or cohabitant, a clear sign that the broken shield of his personal life was failing under the weight of his untreated condition. But the true turning point into madness happened the very next day in the Valley Village neighborhood of Los Angeles. In a scene that felt like a horror movie, Richard allegedly walked into a random residence while wielding a heavy metal hatchet. This was not a calculated crime, but a manifestation of a fragmented mind. He was reportedly in a psychotic state, searching for a girlfriend who was not even in the building. The investigation into the hatchet incident reveals the sheer terror of the family inside the home. The homeowners, who were present with their young children, witnessed a natural giant entering their sanctuary with a deadly weapon. The children were screaming for help as the situation escalated into a life-or-death confrontation. The homeowners were forced to pull a firearm to defend their family, a desperate measure that finally stopped Richard's advance. He was eventually tackled to the ground before a friend arrived to tell him he was at the wrong house. This was a profound, darkest hour for everyone involved, yet Silento seemed unable to grasp the gravity of his actions. He was arrested a block away, but the legal system's broken shield allowed him to remain on the streets while facing 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon. His failure to appear for his court hearing in September led to a bench warrant, but the descent was only accelerating toward a much more violent conclusion. The chaos continued in October 2020, when the investigation tracked Silento to an interstate in Georgia at 3 in the morning. He was spotted by a police officer driving his luxury BMW SUV at a dangerous speed of 143 miles per hour in a 65-mile-per-hour zone. When the officer finally pulled him over, Richard's big voice was used to deliver a series of delusional justifications. He claimed that his celebrity status justified his reckless driving, telling the officer that because 10 cars were following him, he was not a regular person and had the right to exceed the maximum speed limits. This was a clear turning point, where his untreated bipolar disorder had evolved into a state of grandiose narcissism and dangerous paranoia. He told the cop to look on his computer, convinced that his digital fame provided a broken shield against the laws of the road. He was charged with reckless driving and exceeding speed limits, but his mind was already moving toward a darker and more complex conspiracy. Following this arrest, the investigation shows that Richard's paranoia reached its utopian peak. He publicly accused the police of racial profiling and claimed they had spat on him, but his allegations became increasingly untethered from reality. He told the media that government satellites were tracking his every move and that he was receiving daily messages from Donald Trump begging for help with re-election efforts. This was the final, darkest hour of his public sanity. He was a natural giant lost in a labyrinth of his own making, convinced he was a central player in a global political drama while his actual life was falling apart. The big voice that once brought joy to millions was now a vessel for hoarse screams and conspiracy theories. Despite his management's pleas for a psychiatric evaluation, Silento remained isolated, a ticking time bomb wandering through a world he no longer understood. The stage was now set for the most tragic turning point of all, where the violence would finally move from strangers and cars to his own flesh and blood. The natural giant was now fully consumed by the shadows that had been chasing him since his birth. The sixth act of the Richard Hawk investigation reaches its most devastating conclusion in the early morning hours of January 21, 21. On a quiet residential street in Panthersville, Georgia, the world of Silento finally collided with the ultimate darkest hour. Police received a frantic call at approximately 3 in the morning, reporting multiple gunshots echoing through the neighborhood. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found 34-year-old Frederick Rooks lying in the middle of the pavement, bleeding heavily from multiple gunshot wounds to his face and legs. Despite the best efforts of emergency responders, Rooks was pronounced dead at the scene. He was not just a random victim of the rising street violence in Atlanta. He was Richard's own cousin, a man who had shared a history and a bloodline with the global superstar. This was the moment where the internal demons Silento had been fighting since his drug-exposed birth finally manifested as a permanent and irreversible tragedy. The investigation into the shooting initially lacked a direct suspect, as there were no eyewitnesses who were willing to come forward immediately. However, the broken shield of secrecy was shattered by modern technology. Detectives began a meticulous search for digital evidence, collecting video footage from multiple residential security cameras and Ring doorbell systems throughout the area. The footage captured several high-speed vehicles fleeing the scene immediately after at least one final gunshot was heard. Through a frame-by-frame analysis of the digital files, investigators were able to identify Richard Hawk as the gunman who had fired the shots that ended Frederick Rooks' life. On February 1, 21, the natural giant of the music industry was officially arrested and charged with 4 felonies, including malice murder and felony murder. The investigation revealed that 8 shell casings were found near the body, indicating a level of calculated violence that stood in stark contrast to the utopian image of the teenager who had once taught the world to dance. The motive for the shooting remains one of the most haunting gaps in the entire Richard Hawk case file. Friends and family members were left in a state of shock, unable to explain why Richard would target the man who was his own flesh and blood. There was no clear evidence of a business dispute or a long-standing feud. Instead, the investigation points back to the fragmented mind of a man who was no longer in control of his own reality. Without his prescribed medication and isolated by the pandemic, Richard's big voice had been replaced by the voices of paranoia and delusion. He had transitioned from a utopian dream of being a role model to the darkest hour of being a killer, a transformation that occurred in the shadows of an industry that never truly looked beneath the surface of his viral fame. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that he had been begging for help just months prior on national television, only to fall through the cracks of a broken medical system. Following the arrest, Silento's management team and his publicist attempted to secure a $25,000 bond, arguing that he was not an extraordinary flight risk and should be placed in a secure mental health facility. They claimed that his constitutional rights were being violated by his continued isolation in a jail cell, which they believed was only worsening his psychotic state. However, The judge issued a final turning point by denying the bail request. The court cited Richard's documented history of not taking his medication and the fact that he had previously walked away from a mental health facility in California as evidence that he was a danger to the community. Today, the investigation of Richard Hawk remains a chilling archive of a life destroyed by a genetic curse and the weight of overnight celebrity. The natural giant, who once had over 1 billion views on YouTube, is now defined by the 8 shell casings on a Georgia street, a big voice silenced by the iron bars of a cell as he awaits the final judgment of a life lost to the darkness. The final act of the Richard Hawk investigation moves from the crime scene to the cold reality of a jail cell, where the silence is now the most deafening part of his story. As of 2026, the natural giant who once moved the world with a single dance is a shadow of his former self, isolated within the Georgia penal system. The investigation into his current state reveals a man whose big voice has been replaced by the sterile routine of legal proceedings and psychiatric evaluations. The utopian dream of a $5 million net worth has vanished, consumed by legal fees and the total collapse of his professional brand. This is the ultimate darkest hour of a career that burned too bright and too fast, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and a grieving family. Today, Silento sits in a high-security environment, a broken shield of a human being whose primary struggle is no longer for fame, but for the basic stabilization of a mind that has been fractured since his drug-exposed birth in Stone Mountain. His defense team continues to argue that the legal system is ill-equipped to handle a case rooted so deeply in generational trauma and biological chemical imbalances. They contend that placing a man with diagnosed bipolar disorder and a history of psychotic breaks into a standard jail environment is a turning point toward further tragedy rather than justice. The investigation into the broader context of this case highlights a systemic failure within the Black community regarding mental health awareness. For decades, the invisible enemies of depression, anxiety, and PTSD have been ignored or stigmatized, often mistaken for character flaws rather than medical conditions. Richard Hawk is the tragic face of this crisis, a boy who was given a cocktail of heroin and cocaine in his blood before he was born, and who was then asked to carry the weight of global superstardom at 17 without a healthy foundation. He was a natural giant built on hollow ground, and the industry that profited from his viral hit was nowhere to be found when the cracks began to widen. The investigation also explores the concept of the celebrity broken shield, where the adulation of millions creates a false sense of invincibility. Silento believed that his status as a regular person was erased by his digital success, a delusion that prevented him from seeking the humble, consistent help he desperately needed. The tragedy of Frederick Rooks's death is the final, irreversible price of this delusion. It serves as a darkest hour for the entire family, who lost one member to a grave and another to the state. As the community reflects on this story, it serves as an urgent turning point to discuss how many other young artists are currently fighting demons in silence, fueled by the same pressure to perform a utopian image while their internal world is on fire. The big voice of the community is now calling for a shift in how we protect our youth from the predatory nature of overnight fame and the underlying scars of the environments they originate from. As we close the file on the life and crimes of Richard Lamar Hawk, we are left with a legacy that is as complex as it is heartbreaking. He remains the creator of a dance that brought billions together, a utopian moment of unity that stands in stark contrast to the violence of his final act. The investigation concludes that Silento was both a victim and a perpetrator, a child of a genetic curse who eventually became the source of a family's greatest pain. His story is a warning that money and views are not a broken shield against the reality of untreated mental illness. The silence of his current cell is a haunting reminder that without proper intervention, the cycle of trauma will continue to claim the lives of those we once celebrated. Richard Hawk, the boy who taught the world to watch him whip and nae nae, now spends his days in a world where no one is watching, a natural giant lost in the shadows of a system that only noticed him when he began to bleed.